A woman answers the phone. Her husband is on the line. Her words are correct, but her voice is wrong, flat, mechanical, every pause half a second too long. He listens for a few seconds and hangs up. He calls the police. April 12th, 2000, Cheonan, South Korea. A quiet street, late night. Patrol cars roll in with their lights off. Officers take positions around a two-story house. One detective walks to the door, pretending to be a man bringing ransom money. A short, slim man suddenly bolts from the side of the house. He hits the fence at a run, clears it in one move, cuts through a neighbor's yard and into a narrow alley. The officers chase. Shoes on concrete, shouts in the dark. He almost reaches the end of the lane when they hit him from behind and drive him into the ground. Handcuffs click. Breathing hard, he gives his name quietly. No struggle, no shouting. To the officers, it looks like a failed kidnapping. Ugly, but routine. They book him, sit him in a holding cell, start the paperwork. In the corner of the room, a television plays the late news. On the screen, the national broadcaster shows a police sketch, the face of an unidentified serial killer wanted for 9 murders across southern South Korea. A year of fear, no arrests, no suspects, one surviving witness. A detective looks from the sketch to the man in the cell, the same height, the same build, the same face. He picks up the phone and calls Busan. The next morning, the survivor from one of the attacks, a woman who watched 2 people beaten to death in front of her, who survived by talking to their killer from under a blanket, is brought to Cheonan. She walks into the lineup room. She looks at each man in turn. Her eyes stop on the short, quiet man from the night before. She nods once. He doesn't look at her. He doesn't argue. He doesn't ask what she said. He just says, "It was me. There is a demon inside me. The demon did this." The police think they have closed one kidnapping. What they have actually done is arrest the man who spent 11 months traveling across 10 provinces, breaking into rich people's homes and killing anyone who saw his face. Not for pleasure, not for rage, but to buy himself a normal life. This is the story of Jong Du Yong. Busan, South Korea, December 31st, 1968. The last day of the year, the last hours of the last night. In the southern port city of Busan, South Korea's second largest city, a place of shipyards and steep hillside neighborhoods and the constant noise of commerce, a boy is born, the youngest of 4 children. His name is Jong Du Yong. He enters the world on the final day of 1968, and from the very beginning, the world is already preparing to let him go. When he is 2 years old, his father dies of cancer. His mother is left alone with 4 small children and no income in a country still rebuilding from the devastation of the Korean War. She remarries, and she makes a decision that will define her youngest son's entire life. She sends the children to live with their uncle. Jeong is 5 years old when his uncle decides he cannot manage the responsibility and places the children in an orphanage. He is 7 when his mother takes him back, to her new home, to her new husband, to what might have been a second chance. He adjusts. He tries. A few months pass. Then he is returned to the orphanage again. Think about what that means for a 7-year-old boy. Not abandoned once, twice, by the one person in the world whose biological and legal and moral obligation was to keep him. The message, delivered without explanation, was this: "You are not worth the trouble of keeping." South Korean orphanages in the 1970s were underfunded, overcrowded, and largely unsupervised by any external authority. Children raised each other. The older and stronger ones dominated. The smaller, quieter ones either adapted fast or suffered continuously. Jong Du Yong was small, 164 centimeters, as a fully grown adult, lean and physically unimposing. He was not the kind of child who naturally commanded space or respect. He learned. He watched how power worked in that environment, not through kindness, not through connection, but through force and the willingness to use it without hesitation. He understood, at an age when most children are learning multiplication tables, that showing need was dangerous. That softness invited predation, that the only way to be left alone was to make it costly for anyone to bother you. By the time he reached adolescence, these weren't beliefs he had consciously constructed. They were simply the architecture of how he experienced the world, invisible to him the way gravity is invisible, just the way things are, just the rules of the place he lived. On the outside, nothing about him suggested any of this. Neighbors who later spoke to reporters used almost identical language, independently of each other. Polite, quiet, never any trouble. Always said hello in the hallway, didn't drink, didn't smoke, kept to himself, but not in a way that seemed strange. Nobody felt afraid of him. Nobody ever noticed anything wrong. 164 centimeters tall, 64 kilograms, unremarkable face, unremarkable clothes, the kind of man you pass on the street 100 times and could not pick out of a photograph the next day. Criminal profiler Il-yong, who would go on to become South Korea's first officially appointed criminal profiler, in significant part because of this very case, later spoke at length about Jeong's psychological profile. His assessment: a person abandoned by their parents, then by their extended family, then by the state's own welfare system, internalizes a single foundational belief, that in this world everyone stands alone. No one will come for you, no one owes you protection, and therefore you owe nothing to anyone else. That belief, quietly calcified over 30 years, would cost 9 people their lives. He was 18 years old when he killed for the first time. May 1986, Busan. He broke into an elementary school after hours, looking for cash. A teacher was still inside the building. Jong Du Yong pulled a knife and attacked. The teacher survived, but the threshold had been crossed, the one that most people spend their entire lives standing far back from, the one that, once passed, is never truly uncrossed. 1 month later, June 1986, a community patrol officer named Kim Chang-il was walking his beat in a residential neighborhood in Busan. He was 43 years old, a husband, a father, a man doing ordinary work on an ordinary evening. He stopped a young man on the street for a routine document check, the kind of interaction that happens thousands of times a day across every city in South Korea, lasting less than a minute, meaning nothing to either party. That young man was Jong Du Yong. Jeong led the officer off the main road, suggesting they step aside to avoid blocking foot traffic, into a side alley, away from streetlights, away from witnesses. He drew a knife. He drove it into Officer Kim's chest. Kim Chang-il died at the scene. At trial, the judge asked the question everyone needed answered: why? What did this officer do? Was there an argument, a threat, a history between these two men? Jong Du Yong's answer was delivered quietly, without agitation. I felt like he was looking down on me. That was the complete answer, a perceived expression of condescension lasting perhaps 5 seconds, from a civil servant doing his job. Kim Chang-il, 43 years old, husband, father, died because Jong Du Yong interpreted a look. The court sentenced him to 12 years. He served 11. During that time, something that looked like rehabilitation occurred. Jeong enrolled in every educational program the prison offered. He completed his secondary school equivalency. He passed professional certification exams. He attended classes consistently and without incident. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of success story the correction system pointed to when defending its own effectiveness. He was released. Within months, arrested again, theft, 6 months. Released in March of 1999. By that point, 8 separate criminal convictions, more than a decade of incarceration across multiple sentences, released, reoffended, reincarcerated, released again, 8 times over. At no point in this cycle did anyone ask what Jong Du Yong needed that he had never been given. At no point did the system look at the pattern and ask what it was producing. What it produced in March of 1999 was a 30-year-old man walking out of prison for the last time with a plan more detailed and more ruthless than anything he had attempted before. While Jong Du Yong was serving his most recent sentence, he formed a relationship with a woman on the outside. She wrote to him, she visited, she waited, and through her, for the first time in the documented record of his life, he developed a vision of a future. He wanted an apartment, a real one, with his name on the deed in a real neighborhood. He wanted a wedding. He wanted to open a computer café, the small internet gaming establishments that had exploded across South Korea in the late 1990s, packed with young people, humming with keyboards and monitor light, the kind of business that a person with modest capital and no specialized credentials could actually run. He had thought about it carefully. He had calculated the startup costs, the rent, the equipment. He had arrived at a specific number, 1 billion won, roughly 800,000 US dollars at the time. That was the amount he believed he needed, not just to start the life, but to secure it so completely that nothing could remove it. Every possession he had ever had been taken back. His place in his family, his childhood, his years. He was not going to build something that could be repossessed. He was not impulsive. He was not chaotic. He selected targets methodically, wealthy residential neighborhoods, large private homes, properties that signaled the kind of accumulated wealth that meant a safe would be standard. He surveilled locations before entering. He identified access points and learned occupancy patterns. When a witness appeared, he did not panic. He assessed the situation and acted on a calculation that had already been made in advance. The witness was an obstacle, and the obstacle needed to be removed. He brought no weapons to any crime scene. Every instrument of violence, hammers, bats, tools, was found inside the target property. This was not improvisation. It was operational discipline. A weapon carried from home creates a chain of evidence. A weapon found at the scene creates nothing traceable. At the moment of his arrest, police froze a bank account in Jong Du Yong's name. Inside, 130 million won, every amount from every robbery deposited in sequence, the dates matching the crimes almost perfectly. He had spent nothing on himself, no better food, no new clothes, no indulgence of any kind. The account was a monument to a future that existed only in arithmetic. Profiler Il-yong described the psychological architecture of this with precision. He derived no pleasure from the act of killing. There was no ritual, no signature behavior, no emotional escalation between crimes. The victims were obstacles, equivalent, in his cognitive framework, to a locked door or a security system. He removed them because the calculation required it, and then he continued. Most serial offenders leave behavioral fingerprints driven by compulsion or fantasy. Jeong left nothing but operational logic. That is what made him so extraordinarily difficult to detect, and so dangerous. 9 people are in the ground because of an apartment that was never purchased, because of a wedding that never happened, because one man, abandoned by every person and institution that should have claimed him, decided that the ordinary life he had been denied was something he would simply acquire through force, and that anyone standing between him and it was a problem to be solved. June 2nd, 1999. Busan, Bumindong District. Jong Du Yong had been out of prison for less than 3 months. He had selected a large private mansion in one of Busan's wealthiest residential zones, the kind of neighborhood where the houses have gates and the gates have locks, and the money inside is generational. The location carried a detail that would only become ironic later. It sat directly adjacent to the official residence of the chief prosecutor of the Busan High Court. The first murder of the campaign happened within sight of the building, where the man responsible for prosecuting serious crime in the region went home each evening. He approached. The house was empty. The residents had moved out the day before. He moved to the neighboring property. Inside was a housekeeper, a woman in her 50s, surnamed Lee. She was alone, doing the work of her day in a house that had employed her. She heard him. She saw him. She ran. He caught her. He dragged her into the bathroom. He picked up a hammer that was there. He used it. He left with 200,000 won, less than $200. He went home. He deposited the money. The first entry in the account, September 15th, 1999. Busan, Dongdaesan-dong District. 3.5 months passed. He did not operate during that interval, or if he did, no record of it survived. He was patient in a way that serial offenders typically are not. He waited for the right property, the right timing, the right calculation. He entered a 6-story residential building via the rooftop access point. In the first apartment, he found 9 million won in cash. The residents were not home. He took the money without incident and moved to the balcony. He climbed across the exterior of the building to the adjacent unit. A housekeeper was inside. She was alone. He killed her with blunt force and left through the same route he had used to enter. Busan police recorded the death. Detectives noted the robbery element. They did not connect it to Bumindong. Different district, different method of entry, months apart, different victim profile. Without a centralized behavioral database, without analysts trained to look for patterns across jurisdictional lines, the 2 murders remained in separate folders on separate desks. There was no mechanism to see them as the work of a single person. Jeong understood this intuitively. He had not studied criminology, but he had spent the better part of his adult life being processed by a system organized by geography, and he understood, in the operational part of his mind, that crossing enough boundaries made you invisible. He crossed them deliberately every time. October 2nd, 1999. Ulsan, Okdong District. Ulsan is not Busan. Different city, different province, different police agency. He drove there. The house he selected was a 2-story private residence in a prosperous neighborhood. He made entry after dark. Inside, a woman in her 50s and her adult son. The son was approximately 180 centimeters tall. He weighed over 100 kilograms. He was, by every physical measure, substantially more dangerous than the man who had entered his home. Jeong secured both of them in separate rooms, using furniture and whatever else was available to block movement. He dealt with the mother first. Then the door gave way. The son had broken free. He came fast, and he came angry. A large, powerful man in his own home, fighting for his life in a corridor with no room to maneuver. This was not in the calculation. For the first time in the campaign, Jeong was physically outmatched and cornered. In the entryway of the house, there happened to be a toolbox. He reached inside. He found a hammer. The son did not die at the scene. He was taken to the hospital. He died there hours later from his injuries. Jong Du Yong drove back to Busan. He deposited the money. He went to sleep. This was the moment the campaign most clearly should have ended. Cornered by a larger opponent, improvising under pressure in a city where no one knew who he was. He had improvised through it without losing control, without leaving anything behind, without being seen by a single person who could describe him. The plan continued. November and December 1999. Reconnaissance. During this period, investigators later determined Jeong conducted multiple exploratory entries into residential properties that produced no robbery and no violence. He was scouting, updating his map, identifying which properties in which neighborhoods had the internal layouts and the liquid wealth that made them worth the risk. He treated it like a job. Regular hours, methodical assessment, no emotional involvement. March 11, 2000. Busan, Seo-gu, Seodae-sindong District. This was the largest single operation of the campaign, and it was also the one that began to destroy him, though he would not know it for another month. He entered a large private residence. 3 women were inside. He attacked with a baseball bat. 2 died. The 3rd was still alive on the floor when he turned to look at her. She was a young mother. She looked at him and spoke. She told him she had a small child at home. She told him she would not call the police. She told him she would say nothing to anyone. She spoke clearly and directly, not screaming, not pleading hysterically, just talking to him, one person to another, as if she could reach whatever part of him was still a human being. He looked at her for a moment. Then he covered her with a blanket. He said, "Stay still. Take care of your child. If you call the police, I will come back." Then he turned to the safe. He had no tools to open it. He found a pair of dumbbells in the house. For the next 2 hours and 50 minutes, he beat the safe with those dumbbells, steadily, methodically, without stopping. The noise was loud enough that a neighbor in the building heard it clearly and assumed there was renovation work happening nearby. She did not investigate. She did not call anyone. He left with 67 million won. The woman under the blanket kept her promise and waited until he was gone. Then she called the police. She described him in careful, precise detail. His height, his build, the shape of his face, the way he moved, the tone of his voice. From her account, investigators created a composite sketch of the suspect, the first concrete visual evidence in 9 months of investigation. That sketch would end his freedom. He just had 4 more weeks. April 8, 2000. Busan, Oncheon-dong District. His final attack. He entered the home of Jong Jin-tae, 76 years old, chairman of a steel manufacturing company, a man who had spent decades building a business. 2 other people were in the house, a housekeeper and an elderly grandmother. He killed Jong Jin-tae and the housekeeper. The grandmother, he believed, was also dead. He left her where she lay. He took a check worth 24.3 million won and walked out. The grandmother was not dead. She had survived, conscious, present for everything that had happened. When police arrived, she could speak. She described the man who had entered her home. She described his face. Later, in person, she would identify Jong Du Yong without hesitation. 2 survivors, 2 witnesses who could put a face to the name. A composite sketch already circulating through police channels across the southern provinces. The account now held 130 million won. 4 days until it ended. April 12, 2000, Cheonan. He had identified the home of a local businessman named Park. He broke in expecting cash, expecting a safe, expecting the operation he had now run almost a dozen times across 3 cities. There was nothing. The safe was inaccessible. The cash wasn't there. The calculation had failed. He did something he had never done before. He improvised around the failure rather than walking away from it. He took the man's wife hostage. He told her exactly what to say and made her call her husband. Come home, bring money, come alone, tell no one. She delivered the message perfectly, every word correct, every sentence in order. But the tone was wrong. The way she said his name was wrong. The pauses were wrong in a way that only someone who knew her voice completely would recognize. Her husband hung up and called the police immediately. Officers arrived in silence and established a perimeter. A plainclothes detective approached the front door in the role of the husband with the ransom. The house was surrounded. Inside, something shifted in Jeong's awareness. He moved toward a side exit. He saw a uniform. Every instinct accumulated over 15 years of criminal operation fired simultaneously. He hit the fence at a run, cleared it, was into the neighboring yard and down the alley before anyone could close the gap. Officers gave chase on foot through the dark. They caught him within minutes. He was taken down, handcuffed, and transported to the station. Late that night, a detective on the processing team was sitting at his desk with the television on in the background. KBS was running its nightly news update on the unsolved Southern murders, the case that had been on the wall of every detective's office in Busan and Ulsan for 9 months. The composite sketch from the Seodae-sindong survivor appeared on screen. The detective looked up from his paperwork. He looked at the television. He looked through the glass at the holding cell. He looked back at the television. He called Busan. By the following morning, the woman from Seodae-sindong, the one who had spoken to the killer from under a blanket, who had described his face in precise detail, who had given investigators the only visual evidence they had, was brought to Cheonan. She walked into the room. She scanned the faces. She stopped at one. She nodded once. He did not look up. He did not speak immediately. Then, quietly, "It was me." And he talked. He gave the locations, the dates, the victims by name. He provided details that had never been made public, things only the person who had been in those rooms could know. 9 murders confirmed in a single morning by the man who had committed them. July 21st, 2000, Busan District Court. The prosecution laid out the full scope. 9 murders, crimes across 10 provinces, robbery totals exceeding 330 million won, a year-long campaign conducted with deliberate operational discipline. The evidence was comprehensive. A full confession, 2 surviving witnesses who had identified the defendant in person. Bank records documenting the stolen funds in sequential deposits matched to crime dates. Physical evidence from multiple scenes. The defense had almost no room to operate. The defendant himself had provided the most detailed account of the crimes that existed. There were no credible grounds to challenge identification because Jeong had confirmed every location himself. No argument about unreliable witnesses carried weight when the accused had already told investigators what those witnesses were going to say before they said it. The court sentenced him to death. In the courtroom, families of the victims heard the verdict in near silence. For them, the sentence answered one question and left every other one untouched. No sentence explains why a 76-year-old man was beaten to death in his own home. No verdict restores a housekeeper to the family that depended on her. The law provides categories and consequences. It does not provide meaning. On November 30th, 2000, the appeals court reviewed the case in full and upheld the original sentence: death. What followed was legally unusual. Jong Du Yong chose not to file a final cassation appeal with the Supreme Court. Under South Korean law, a death sentence does not become binding until all possible appeals have been pursued or formally waived. By declining to file, Jeong closed his own case. He accepted the verdict himself, without being compelled to, without any apparent negotiation. Some observers interpreted this as a form of remorse. Others saw it as the act of a man who had already calculated with characteristic precision that fighting a verdict supported by his own detailed confession was a waste of the time he had left. Either way, the sentence was final. He was transferred to a maximum security facility, and then South Korea did nothing. The country's last execution had been carried out on December 30th, 1997. 3 men hanged on the same day, the final time the state had used capital punishment. Since then, a de facto moratorium had been in place. No formal policy change, no legislative action, simply a decision at every subsequent level of government not to schedule any executions. The death row population continued to accumulate. The sentences remained on record. The prisoners remained alive, in a permanent legal condition that no one in the system seemed willing to resolve in either direction. Jong Du Yong joined that population, condemned to death by the state, kept alive by the same state indefinitely. 2 men who had helped him were also prosecuted. His brother Jong Du Yong operated a jewelry shop and had converted stolen goods and checks into usable cash across multiple transactions. A pawn shop owner named Kim Jong-jun had done the same. Both were charged as accessories after the fact. Both received 18-month sentences. Both served their time and were released. The prosecution could not establish to the legal standard required that either man had known with certainty where the valuables came from. The law as written had limits. They walked out. 16 years passed. South Korea transformed in that time, economically, technologically, culturally. The computer cafe industry that Jeong had once planned to enter became a national institution and then began its gradual decline as smartphones changed how people consumed entertainment. The country's film and music industries became global forces. A new generation grew up with no personal memory of the Southern murders that had defined a moment in 1999 and 2000. Inside Daejeon Correctional Institution, none of this reached Jong Du Yong except as background noise. He was in one of South Korea's most secure facilities. 3 separate perimeter walls, guard towers at intervals, razor wire, regular head counts, and cell checks. He had been there for over a decade. He was 47 years old. His death sentence had never been carried out, and given the direction of Korean policy, it seemed increasingly unlikely that it ever would be. He was, in practical terms, serving life imprisonment under a different label. At some point, 2015 or possibly earlier, he began to plan again. Long-term inmates at Daejeon were assigned to light industrial work inside the facility's manufacturing operations, basic production tasks designed to occupy time and generate modest revenue for the prison system. For most inmates, it was tedium. For Jeong, it was access to materials. Over the course of several months, he began diverting components from the production process: small sections of pipe, lengths of wire, metal fittings and brackets, each piece individually meaningless, the kind of minor inventory variance that might be explained a dozen different ways. He concealed them within legitimate building supplies and storage materials in the workshop, accumulating slowly with the same patient operational discipline he had demonstrated 2 decades earlier across 10 provinces. He built a 4-meter metal ladder inside a maximum security prison. Using only materials available to him in the manufacturing facility, with no outside assistance, without triggering a single inspection or inventory check during the entire construction process. On the night of August 6, 2016, he moved. He wrapped a blanket around the first run of razor wire on the primary perimeter wall, padding it enough to allow him to grip and climb without being cut to the point of incapacitation. He mounted the first wall. He cleared it. He moved to the second perimeter. He cleared that too. He was now in the corridor between the second and third walls, the final stretch. If the guard rotation timing was right, he had a narrow window. He placed the ladder against the third wall. He began to climb. The ladder broke. He fell. Guards were on him within seconds. He was 47 years old. He had a death sentence. There was no viable plan for what happened after the third wall. No money, no documents, no network, no destination that made operational sense for a man whose face had been on national television and whose crimes were part of the Korean criminal history curriculum. The probability of a successful escape leading to anything other than rapid recapture was functionally zero. He had planned it anyway, built the ladder anyway, climbed the walls anyway. The Ministry of Justice issued a nationwide directive within weeks. Iron bars were to be installed on all windows in all manufacturing and production areas in every correctional facility in South Korea. Not just Daejeon, every prison in the country. The physical infrastructure of the entire national correction system was permanently modified because of one man's attempt on one night. He received 10 additional months, added to a death sentence that will apparently never be carried out. The consequences of Jong Du Yong's crimes did not end with his arrest. They extended outward through South Korean law enforcement, criminal justice policy, and the broader culture of violent crime in the country, in ways that are still visible today. The most direct institutional consequence was the creation of professional criminal profiling in South Korea. Before 2000, the Korean National Police Agency had no formal behavioral analysis capacity. Investigations were organized by jurisdiction, by which precinct, which city, which province owned the case file. When a killer operated across multiple administrative boundaries, as Jeong had done systematically, there was no mechanism for recognizing a single offender in what appeared to be a series of isolated regional incidents. Each murder was processed independently. Each detective worked their own file. The dots were on separate desks in separate buildings in separate cities, and no one's job was to connect them. In 1998, 2 years before the arrest, a researcher named Kim Yong-ah and a behavioral psychologist named Kwon Il-yong had founded a small private organization focused on criminal identification science. They had no government funding, no official standing, and no formal role in active investigations. They existed at the academic margins of a system that had not yet recognized what they were offering. After Jeong's arrest demonstrated precisely what the absence of behavioral analysis had cost: 9 murders that might have been connected faster, potentially before the final 4 victims died. The police agency acted. Kwon Il-yong was formally appointed South Korea's first official criminal profiler in 2000, embedded within the national investigative structure. A new discipline entered Korean law enforcement because of 9 murders that should not have happened, in a campaign that should have been identified earlier. The second consequence is darker. In 2003, a man named Du-yeong began killing in Seoul. Over the following year, he murdered 20 people, the highest confirmed body count in South Korean criminal history. He targeted wealthy homeowners and sex workers, alternating between victim groups with a calculated awareness of how police resources would be allocated. He was arrested in July 2004. During interrogation, Du-yeong spoke openly about his influences. He named Jong Du Yong specifically and deliberately. He described studying Jeong's approach, the selection of wealthy residential targets, the use of weapons found on site, the operational discipline of moving across jurisdictions. He adopted specific tactical details from Jeong's method, including the habit of operating during rainy weather, when pedestrian traffic drops, ambient noise rises, and the likelihood of being seen by a neighbor who looks out a window decreases significantly. One man's crimes became another man's instruction manual. Du-yeong is currently also on South Korea's death row. His sentence has not been carried out. 2 of the most prolific killers in the country's documented criminal history sit in separate facilities, both condemned, both alive, the second one shaped in part by the methods of the first. Jong Du Yong is 57 years old. He was born on the last day of 1968 in a port city in a country that was still rebuilding from war, to a family that would not keep him. He has spent more years inside a prison cell than he spent outside of one. He went in for the first time at 18. The intervals between sentences were brief, months, occasionally a year, before the system cycled him back. He was never, in any meaningful sense, free. The woman he wanted to marry is gone. The apartment was never purchased. The computer cafe was never opened. The wedding photographs were never taken. The life he had calculated his way toward, the one ordinary, unremarkable, statistically common life that he had been denied at every stage of his development, existed only in a bank account that the state froze the morning after his arrest. 130 million won, deposited with discipline and patience over 11 months. Not a single one touched. The families of 9 people did not get to wait for anything. A 76-year-old man who had spent decades building a business died on the floor of his own home. Housekeepers who had done nothing except be present in the houses where they worked were killed for being witnesses to a robbery. A son who broke down a door and fought with everything he had still died in a hospital bed hours later. A young mother survived by talking to a killer from under a blanket and has carried that conversation with her for 26 years. They received what the justice system provides: a case number, a conviction, a sentence. The sentence has never been carried out. The man who killed 9 people is alive and 57 years old, behind walls he once almost climbed. What the record also shows, and this is a fact, not an excuse, is that the state which sentenced Jong Du Yong to death is the same state that placed him in an institution at 5, returned him there at 7, processed him through a correction system that released him 8 times across 2 decades, and never once created a moment in which anyone asked, "What does this person need that he has never had?" The profilers who now work within the Korean National Police Agency, the framework built after this case in direct response to its failures, are trained to ask exactly that question, not to reduce accountability, not to manufacture sympathy for people who have done terrible things, but because the only tool that actually prevents the next crime is understanding the full architecture of the one before it, including the 30 years of structural failure that preceded the first act. Jong Du Yong wanted one thing: an apartment, a wife, a door with his name on it, a business he could run, a place in the world that belonged to him and could not be taken back. He had never had any of those things. He had been removed from every place he ever occupied, his family, his home, his freedom, by forces larger than himself, beginning before he was old enough to understand what was happening. He killed 9 people trying to purchase his way into a normal life. And the life never came, and the man he became in trying to reach it guaranteed that it never would. He is still in the cell, still behind the 3 walls he almost cleared in the dark on a night in August 2016, 47 years old, with nothing waiting for him on the other side except a country that had already moved on. The demon he spoke of in the police station, the one he named in those first quiet words after his arrest, was not something foreign that arrived from outside him. It was built over 30 years, layer by layer, by every person and institution that looked at a child and decided he was someone else's problem. Understanding that is not forgiveness. It is the only honest account of what actually happened.